police abolition is about envisioning a world that we'd like to get to where we have addressed the problems of these profound inequalities to such a degree that we don't need people with guns and cages for human beings to produce safety.
What's up, friends and damn givers? This is the Let's Give a Damn podcast. I'm your host, Nick LaPara, and this is the show where I sit down for meaningful conversations with people who saw something wrong in the world and gave a damn about it. I truly hope today's conversation gives you hope and pushes you to give more damns than ever before. Well, it's 10:30 p.m. I have a delicious cup of coffee sitting next to me, and I'm so excited to introduce you to my next guest. On this episode, I have the distinct pleasure of speaking with Alex Vitale. Alex is professor of sociology and the coordinator of the Policing and Social Justice Project at Brooklyn College. He has spent more than 30 years writing about policing, and he consults with both police departments and human rights organizations all over the world. Alex Vitale is the author of City of Disorder, How the Quality of Life Campaign Transformed New York Politics, and his latest work in 2017, The End of Policing. He has also written for the New York Times, Washington Post, The Guardian, The Nation, Vice News, Fortune, USA Today, and others. And he has appeared on The Daily Show with Trevor Noah and many other shows like it. And we're so honored to have him on this show. During our chat, we focus on his book, The End of Policing. We talk briefly about what it means to defund the police versus abolishing the police. We talk a little bit about the history of policing in this country, and we discuss why something needs to change soon. Now, I know this is a hot topic right now. This conversation makes some folks very angry. Many of you have cops in your family, or maybe you're a cop, or you have just a massive amount of respect for the policing community. I just want you to know that this conversation is not the end-all be-all conversation on this matter. We talk about his book, his work, the 30 years of work that he has done, but we don't get too in-depth, okay? So listen to this conversation, take it all in, and then begin to do your homework. Don't write off this topic before you do the research and study. Buy Alex's book, and there are many other brilliant resources and lectures out there that I'll link to in the show notes. If your response to this, even this title or this intro, is simply, well, we can't not have a police, that's stupid. What about all the bad guys? Which is something I've heard many times in the last week in different conversations I've been having. So if that's your immediate reaction, then please take a deep breath, listen to this conversation, start studying, and begin researching, because this is a complex issue with only complex answers, nuanced answers. It is not black and white. It's not easy, but this topic is worth checking out if we truly want a country that is for all people, not just some, and a country that wants life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness for everyone. Okay? Now that I've said that, why don't we jump right in? My email is hello@letsgiveadamn.com. Hit me up anytime for any reason. I'd love to hear from you. And now, my conversation with the brilliant Alex Vitale. Let's go. Welcome to the Let's Give a Damn podcast, Alex Vitale. Thank you so much for joining us this morning.
You bet, Nick.
I'm super excited. We're not about the topic necessarily that we're going to talk about, because it's heavy and it's complex and it's very polarizing. But I'm excited that we get a chance. We've addressed the last few months, well, the last few years, but especially the last few months, where there's been a heightened sense of what the hell do we do about this huge issue that we have right now. I have friends that have been downtown for 60 plus days. I live in Nashville right now. And I have friends that have been downtown Nashville for 60 plus days, fighting against the powers that be and fighting against things that shouldn't be. We shouldn't have to fight about this. These should be a given, and yet we're fighting about them. So there's so much going on. So I'm excited to have you on, someone that can, again, I've had other guests on that have talked very intelligently about these issues, but I think we're going to have a deeper conversation here today. So you are the author of The End of Policing. And that title obviously caught my mind for a bunch of different reasons. It caught my eye for a bunch of different reasons. Before we get to your book and before we get to all the things that you are going to teach us and kind of help us understand in a greater and deeper way, I always love to spend a couple minutes getting to know our guests a little bit, because whenever I ask for the story, for the background, something or some things always come up that help us kind of connect the dots in so many ways as to why you chose to do the things that you're doing today. So for a couple minutes, could you give us the background, the who, what, when, where, and why of Alex Vitale's life, kind of what led you to do this important work that is so meaningful and so needed right now in our time in history?
Sure. Well, I grew up in Houston in the 70s and 80s, it was 60s, 70s, and 80s, and went off to college in the early to mid 80s and was interested in urban affairs kind of broadly, and ended up looking at like economic development programs and community development initiatives, housing stuff, and ended up in California working at the San Francisco Coalition on Homelessness after school, doing that kind of stuff, helping to develop housing policy for the city and county of San Francisco, working in coalition with service providers, labor unions, and others to ensure spending for public health measures and social services that directly benefited homeless folks. And it was during that time that I got pulled into this work. In a lot of ways, the academic discourse around urbanism had very little to say about policing and crime. And then criminology as an academic discipline had nothing to say about housing, healthcare, social, or very little to say about those things. These were like distinct spheres. And what I learned from my experiences in San Francisco was that these things, in fact, are intricately connected.
Yes.
And what I witnessed firsthand was really that the city of San Francisco, like so many cities at that time period, gave up on the possibility of actually housing people and instead turned the problem over to the police to manage. And so that policing is not like just this given. It's a set of strategic political decisions about whether or not police should be tasked with managing certain kinds of problems. And what I saw and what I still see is just the turning over of an ever-growing list of problems to the criminal justice system. And that is not a given. We could choose to approach those problems in other ways.
Yeah,
and I'll just finish by saying, and then I moved to New York in '93 to go back to school to look at global cities, right as Giuliani gets elected in New York City, and the whole thing played out there. And so I became even more interested in these connections.
Yeah, you lived through some interesting years in New York City, which I'm sure we'll get into here in a minute. Before we go too far into that, because I have there's so much that I want to tackle. You kind of brought up, I think, the crux of our conversation, our forthcoming conversation. But here's what I want to dig into just for a minute. Maybe there's nothing there. If not, we'll move on. But you were interested, it seems like from a, maybe not a young age, at least from a teenager thinking about college, you were interested in how to help people, right? How to dig into kind of these deeper issues that take time, and they're not simple. They're very complex. And we'll talk about some of that complexity here in a minute. Where did that come from? Was that something that you sort of developed on your own, or mentors, or, parents, or how did was that sort of the environment you grew up in, or was that something you had to like go out and seek?
So, no, I grew up in a pretty political household. So my father had been an elected official in Illinois before I was born. And my mother ran for a small office in Houston, and they were both active in civil rights-oriented organizing in Texas in the 1960s. So, and my father's side of the family in Illinois were all coal miners and were very active in unionization and fights within the union, within the United Mine Workers. So I think of myself as kind of a fourth generation unionist. I'm also have been a union officer and activist for a number of years. So the politics came fairly naturally. And, my idea of rebelling was that I also read the Wall Street Journal, in my spare time, and kind of wanted to get out of Houston and explore places where there was a greater diversity of political organizing, et cetera, going on.
Yeah, I'm glad you said that. I'm glad you kind of pointed out that there were different factors. Sometimes people kind of fall into it, or they have some sort of inclination, or an outside factor kind of pulls them in. But to be honest, I'm fairly young. I'm in my mid 30s, but growing up, like the only time that I ever heard politics talked about was mostly to badmouth one political leader, the president. That was it. There was no talk of congresswomen, congressmen, senators, representatives, mayors, council members. It was none of that. It was only when my parents or the people around me wanted to badmouth one person, and that was a president that they didn't like or whatever. And so I didn't grow up in that. And it wasn't until my mid 20s that I really took, actually late 20s, that I took more of an interest. And no, this is something that not just at a federal level, but at a state level. And I spent most of my growing up years overseas and then moved back in my mid 20s. Maybe that's why I got interested, is because I saw how fucked up everything was here. And it was like, I need to know really what's going on, not just at a federal level, but at a state and at a city and at a town level, right? Wherever I'm living. And so I'm glad to hear that was sort of your environment, because that's what we're trying to do with our kids. Is I want to bring them up in a household where there's truth, and where they are seeing that truth lived out in community and political action. And they've already seen that. We've attended marches, and they're very aware of what's going on in our society at the best they can at 5, 7, and 8 years old. And so I love hearing that connection. So you are let's bring it to a little bit of modern day. Thanks for sharing some of your story. You're the professor of sociology at Brooklyn College, coordinator of the Policing and Social Justice Project at Brooklyn College, and again, as I already mentioned, the author of the 2017 book, The End of Policing. And that book has a hell of a subtitle. I'm not sure it's technically a subtitle, but on the cover, it says, "The problem is not police training, police diversity, or police methods. The problem is the traumatic and unprecedented expansion and intensity of policing in the last 40 years, a fundamental shift of the role of policing in society. The problem of police in society, the problem is policing itself." So we've seen in the last few months some pretty traumatic things happen in our country. Again, this is not new. You wrote this book in 2017. This is a couple years after Mike Brown, and you've got all these different Eric Garner, and these different cases that have sort of been highlighted, not to mention the thousands, the tens of thousands that have happened without body cams on, or without cell phone footage rolling. And so we're in this time when we can see not we, I say we very loosely, because it's not all Americans, right? There are millions, tens of millions of Americans that have sort of co-opted this Black Lives Matter movement with the Blue Lives Matter and, Back the Blue and all sorts of things. And there doesn't seem to be a willingness to really look at, is there a problem here? It is just an automatic default. And this is something I don't understand about, maybe it's not an American, but I don't understand. It's just the default of, we're going to defend the police. We're going to back the authorities. We're going to back the powers that be, no matter what, because they're there. They must have our best intent. They must have our best intentions in mind, because they're there to protect us. Look, it's right on the side of their car to protect and to serve. But then we see these cases over and over again. In fact, I saw you tweet this morning about a case in the Bronx, right, where the police, I guess, I didn't look into it super, a ton. Maybe you have more context, but this young man, Kowalski Trawick, that was murdered in cold blood by police in his own home, in his own kitchen, while cooking a meal. And the DA decided to not file charges. And so we've got all these cases, so many cases that are just tragic. Some of the most recent ones, George Floyd, which was we used to live in Minneapolis. That was my neighborhood. I know that intersection where he was murdered at Cup Foods. Like, I know that intersection really, really well. So that one hit especially close to home. Talk to us about, you already started to get into it a little bit, but talk about, you mentioned several times in your story in the opening that it's not a given that we continue to pile on all of these responsibilities onto underpaid, under-equipped police that in the first place probably weren't doing all the things they should have been doing And then we demand of them so much more, things they're not equipped to do, things they should never be doing, things that we should not give to someone who is also holding a lethal weapon on their side, right? So your work is super important. Give us sort of a framework for what you're doing and why you're doing it.
Well, I wouldn't say that they're under-equipped and underpaid. I mean, most of them make more than I do, and I'm a tenured full professor at a university. So they're extremely, and mostly in the big cities, when you include things like overtime and a full pension after 20 years, they're much better paid than I am. And they are awash in equipment, armored personnel carriers and sniper rifles and tear gas. So, but to get to the larger point, so the cover of the book that you read, refers to the dynamics in a way of the last 40 or 50 years. So I sometimes like to say, there's part of this story about policing that is about the last 40 or 50 years. And then there's another part that's about the last 200 years. So that policing in its origins and functions has always been primarily a tool for managing the social problems created by regimes of exploitation. So in the late 18th and early 19th century, when modern policing is created, those regimes of exploitation are things like colonialism, slavery, and industrialization. So it's about the suppression of unions, the suppression of slave uprisings, and the capturing of runaway slaves. It's about the suppression of anti-colonial movements, the extermination and driving out, for instance, of the indigenous populations across North America. But today, over this last 40, 50 years, I mean, we don't have slavery and colonialism in that same sense. We barely have industrialization. In fact, what we have is this kind of neoliberal economy where people who are tied to global finance, global corporate activity, multinational corporations have become fabulously wealthy with the direct support of government that has subsidized them, cut their taxes, deregulated them, right? While the rest of us have been dealing with growing economic precarity, downward mobility, insecurity. So this new economic system has produced mass homelessness. I mean, we didn't used to have homelessness in the United States in any large scale. It's produced mass untreated mental health and substance abuse problems. The economic precarity has driven people into black markets of drugs and sex work and stolen and pirated goods. And then police have been tasked with the management of those problems. And if you look at what police really do all day, every day, that's what they're doing. They're managing homeless people.
Yeah.
They're going on mental health crisis calls like this one in the Bronx that ended so terribly. They're dealing with the failures to invest in schools by flooding the schools with police. They're kicking kids off the corner for dealing drugs and hanging out and smoking marijuana, whatever, or in the park. That's what police do, is put a lid on those problems so that those systems of exploitation can continue. And so the exact activities of police change over time depending on what the problems are that they're managing, but we should always look for the roots of those problems in these systems of economic exploitation.
And it's a good point what you brought up earlier when I said they're underpaid and under-equipped. The underpaid was sort of tongue in cheek because that's what I get a lot of times from my friends who, talk about their cop friends who are amazing and they don't, they're one of the good ones. And they don't make enough, blah, 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 blah. And right, but that's not taking into account, again, these pensions and these different benefits they get. And the under-equipped, obviously not, I'm not referring to, weapons and other resources like that, right? Because one of the big problems we have to address and talk about is the militarization of our police force. I mean, I was more, referring to what you just talked about. You've got these cops going on there, and they might even be trained. If you look at this case in the Bronx, like they were trained for crisis, whatever, whatever crisis intervention team, right? CIT, and they still did what they did. So even with the training of, to help with these mental health issues they might encounter, they're still making poor decisions that are ultimately ending in, the snuffing out of innocent lives, right?
I mean, the only reason I mentioned it, right, is because
it is important.
One of these dominant narratives we hear is this police reform narrative that says that the problems of policing are, in fact, that they're underpaid and undertrained and under-resourced, and that the way we prevent, these horrible deaths is we give them more professionalization. We try to stamp out some of the bias and some of the bad apples, and that's all we need to do, that's going to fix the problem. And that means that we don't have to address any of these thornier issues about profound racial and economic inequalities in American society.
Yeah, I mean, systemic racism and other systemic issues like systemic racism are very prevalent, and they are being upheld, as you talked about, like this, the lid being put back on, right? They're being upheld by, we're not addressing the real issues, are we? We're not addressing the fact that even though redlining is illegal, it's still happening today. We're not addressing, so many people look at, a Rayshard Brooks or somebody that was murdered in a Wendy's parking lot, and they look at, oh, he had this and he did that in his past or whatever. And they're looking at this one person that might have a record. They've done this, that, or the other. And we're not looking at the 1,000,001 factors that got them there, right? We're not looking at a George Floyd. One of the first things millions of people try to do is to point out previous things that he had done, right? We're not willing to look at the system as a whole. We, because I've had very, very smart friends of mine, well-meaning, well-intentioned friends, point out that systemic racism cannot exist because it's illegal for it to be so. And I just can't, when I look at them and I, whether visibly or not visibly rubbing my temples, like, how is it possible that you believe that just because something is not legal, that it's still not happening, right? We live in a country where it's possible for the president to get on Fox News last night and literally talk about an act of crime that he's committing, and that is suppressing votes by trying to defund the USPS. He literally said, if they don't have the $25 billion or whatever it was that they need, then they're not going to be able to do all these mail-in votings, right? Like, he literally said, I'm committing a crime, and nobody cares. So we're in a country where the people in the highest office can commit crimes on a regular basis, things that you and I can never get away with. And yet we believe just because systemic racism is illegal and the different components of it are illegal, that it's not happening anymore. It's happening every single day.
And anybody in our society can get any kind of illegal drugs they want whenever they want them, right?
Exactly
the idea
right.
that we can't get drugs because they're illegal is just ludicrous. And this is an example of a kind of liberal erasing of the realities of how the law works. So that produces a lot of these misguided reforms. They imagine that the police are just here to neutrally enforce a legal system that everyone benefits from, without acknowledging the fact that most of what the police do has nothing to do with what's on the law books. They're producing order, not lawfulness, that the laws do not benefit everyone equally. The war on drugs was created to produce racial inequality. That was the point. And we know that because the people who did it have come forward and said that's what it was about.
Yep.
And that if we can just, create a neutral professional law enforcement organization, everything will go back to normal and everything will be fine. And they can just keep arresting young people for marijuana in the park like it's no big deal.
Yeah, if we ever needed proof that the war on drugs was explicitly to hurt people of color, Michelle Alexander's The New Jim Crow is a fantastic resource for that. I've mentioned it before on the podcast. And again, that's not I am admittedly a more progressive person, in my beliefs, but this is a left and a right problem. Both are very guilty at pushing this narrative, whether no matter which ideology it's covered in, and so let's talk about right now my situation in Nashville. I live in a city that is we're the only blue city besides Memphis and Nashville, the only blue areas in this whole sea of red. And 70-ish days ago, when things were really getting heated, some protests started downtown. And 61 days ago, and I participated in those protests, and 62 days ago today, some of my friends started protesting downtown day and night, 24 hours a day. Some of them are on shifts, but they've been down there for 62 days straight. There have been 200 plus arrests. My friend Justin Jones, who's an amazing human and a wonderful activist, he's been arrested 7 times, including yesterday. He was arrested again for aggravated littering is the dumbass charge that they charged him with. And they have had our governor Bill Lee, who's a disgraced leader in so many ways. He has had state troopers hurting, literally manhandling people, arresting them to the tune of, again, over 200 people in 60 days. And yesterday there was he called special session for 3 things. And one of the things, he literally called people back to the city for special session, lawmakers, to talk about how do we make it more criminal for people to protest peacefully on state property. And yesterday was made I think it's a Class E felony, which can get them up to 6 years in prison for peacefully protesting on state property. And so I imagine, they're 3 miles from me right now, and I imagine some more of them will get arrested today. And obviously those unconstitutional laws will be, pushed back on by many more moral people than they. But that's a situation I'm dealing with it every night. I've been down there several nights with them. I almost got arrested the first time I went down. They arrested the black girl next to me and pushed and threw me back over the fence. That was a weird thing, that you would go after the black girl next to me and not arrest me. But it's, one of the conversations we're talking about is abolish the police, defund the police, right? And obviously they have similarities, but they are different. Let's talk about that for the next section of our conversation, because I think it's important. I have been criticized by so many friends and in so many different ways, publicly, privately, for pushing for the abolition of the police, because I don't believe, just as I also, I'm much less educated on this topic and I'm learning more about it, but much like I also push for the abolition of the prison system for many of the same reasons, right? So many of them are tied together. You've talked quite a bit about defunding the police and abolishing the police. Do we defund? Do we abolish? What are the main differences there? And how do we actually do that? Because one of the things that when a red-blooded white American male that owns 3 guns, and is scared of a lot of things around him, most of them that aren't actually real, but he's built up all these fears around him about people of color and about immigrants, and he's listened to a lot of the president's rhetoric. When he hears that, he thinks, well, who am I going to call? What do we do when we get in trouble? And we do live in a country where there are 350 million people, 340 million people, and 400 million guns, right? So more than 1 gun per person. I don't own any. My kids don't own any. And so someone out there has all of our, has our number of guns. How do we do that in this country?
Yeah.
I think we can do it. I want it to happen because I want a peaceful, equitable society in the future for my kids to raise their kids in. But how do we do that? How do we abolish police?
Yeah. So first, let me just say a couple things about Nashville. So Nashville was one of these cities where there was already a kind of defund the police movement underway. And I think that's part of why we've seen this sustained level of protest there, because yes. I think for a lot of people across the country, the first time they ever heard of this idea of defund or abolish the police was at the end of May, beginning of June, when they saw a lot of cardboard signs being held up about defund the police. And there hasn't been enough attention to where did this come from, because it didn't just emerge spontaneously. It's because folks in places like Nashville and Durham and to some extent Memphis, but also Dallas and St. Louis and so many places
that you wouldn't expect to
That's
see
right.
signs.
That's right. Have been developing campaigns to redirect funding from police and jails and youth lockups and prisons into community identified needs to produce public safety. And so in Nashville, people turned out to local city council budget hearings and were lobbying city councilmen, and doing that hard community organizing about shifting the political priorities of the city. And so when Minneapolis happens, they already know that the solution is not going to be more money for police body cameras or another police community encounter session, or more implicit bias training. That stuff is done. We've seen through that nonsense, and we want to reduce the impact of policing on our communities by replacing them with other things. The other thing I want to say about Nashville and the response to the protests is that this echoes what I said before, which is when we see a problem turned over to the police to manage through a process of criminalization, we need to ask who's benefiting from this politically. And that's what's happening here, is that instead of the state of Tennessee taking seriously the demands of communities to redirect these resources to invest in communities in positive ways instead of tearing them down, they're suppressing the movement through criminalization. So it's the exact same dynamic as saying we're not going to house people, we're going to break up their encampments, put them in jail, drive them around the city all night. It's the same dynamic. And this tells us something about what it means when we say defund or abolish the police. Now, in my mind, defund the police is what we would call a non-reformist reform. It's a reform that leads to the possibility of something much more transformative. So it is laying out a logic that says that the solution to abusive policing is not a bunch of superficial reforms designed to restore legitimacy to police. I don't want to restore legitimacy to policing. I don't want to get the public to trust the police. What I want is to have people actually have decent housing, jobs, healthcare, education, etc. That's what I want. And policing is actually an impediment to that. Not only because it sucks up resources that could be used to produce those things, but also because it rests fundamentally on an ideology, on a worldview, on a set of political beliefs that says that the problems in our communities are the result of individual and group moral failure or evilness that will only respond to punitive, coercive, and violent interventions. And that worldview is fundamentally diametrically opposed to a worldview that says that the problems in our society are the result of systems of exploitation that have rested on inequalities of race and class, as well as gender and sexuality in some important ways. And so that when we invest in policing, we're cutting the legs out from under a demand for Medicaid for all, a Medicare for all, a demand for housing for all, a demand for decent schools for everyone. Mm-hmm. So police abolition is about envisioning a world that we'd like to get to where we have addressed the problems of these profound inequalities to such a degree that we don't need people with guns and cages for human beings to produce safety.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's the same thing with, I see the parallels there even with our prison system, right? Where we seem so, maybe this is a bad example. As you were talking, it made me think of even some of the parenting. Well, I should say more than that. I love my parents, and they've changed so much in the last 15, 20 years since I was a kid. But they were in a weird, like, right-wing evangelical Christian cult growing up, and there was really hard discipline measures, right? And there wasn't there wasn't a lot of focus on training. There wasn't a lot of focus on let me build you into being a not just even a decent but a wonderful moral human being. The only time we got sort of this we got a ton of attention was when the rod was coming, when the spanking was coming, right? It was when you did something bad, then you get my full attention. You're going to find out just how shitty that thing you did was, and here's the punishment for it, versus spending a lot of time in different ways. And so the parallel with like the policing is so much of our time and energy and money and resources gets sucked up into building this super robust militarized police state versus putting that money, putting those billions of dollars in the case of many cities, putting those billions of dollars into community efforts, putting those billions of dollars into better schools, all those things that will prevent many of these crimes from happening later on, right? We don't seem to care how they get from point A to point when they commit a crime, whether it's an actual crime or not. We just care that when they commit that crime, that we're ready to snatch them up. Yeah. So in the same way that kind of my upbringing and the kind of discipline I received, there was no like investment in training me. It was just when you fucked up, Nick, then we strike.
Negative attention.
Yeah, that negative attention. And then the same thing is, I think there's a parallel with the prison system, right? We know the recidivism rate is so high because, I mean, basically once you're in again, Michelle Alexander's book talked about this at length. Once you committed a crime, you're in even if it's something super small, super tiny, you'll never make it out of there unless you have the like real intentional mentors and resources around you, because the system is meant that once you're in, you never leave, right? You are, when you get out, the resources are not there to treat you like a human being again. In many cases, you can't vote. Nobody's going to hire you because you have that felony charge on your, no one's, so employers, the state, the city, the state, the country does not treat you like a human ever again because of this charge that you have. And so, yeah, we're not putting the money and the resources, the time and the energy into all of the things, all the programs, all the people, all the jobs that would prevent people from getting to that point in the first place, right?
Americans have a deep love affair with authoritarianism.
Yes.
Now, some of this is rooted in the deep history of American slavery and colonialism and the use of violence and authoritarianism to manage these systems of exploitation that are at the heart of American history and American economic wealth. And this includes international colonialism and imperialism. But also, our roots in a kind of evangelical Christianity. This can't be papered over, But I think it's been made worse, and we've seen this rise of fundamentalism across all religions in recent decades.
Yep.
And I think this is tied to profound insecurities that people are experiencing in the face of global economic trends, the increasing power of multinational corporations, and more, the disruption of the environment and the insecurity that comes with that. And so people are retreating into religious fundamentalism, hoping that this will allow them to build these bulwarks, these walls of family values and parental authority that will protect them and their children from the vicissitudes of, the liquidity of the uncertainty and precarity of the modern global economy. And this is, of course, why people vote for Trump, is that the big daddy billionaire is going to save us. He's going to, throw a wrench into this global system that's messed up our lives. And the challenge before us is to work with people to point out that the people who actually benefit from these arrangements are not like liberal elites. They're global corporations and big banks and high finance and these things, and try to come up with a program for creating more safety, sustainability, economic security, family security. I mean, the irony is that the Republicans are the ones who support policies that undermine family security,
Yeah.
clothed in this language of freedom, when it's the left that has a real program for child support and better health care and better access to education and things like this. So we have a lot of work to do to articulate a positive aspirational agenda for safety and security that's not rooted in competition and exploitation.
Yeah, you're very correct and wise to point out that Americans sort of they're enamored with authoritarianism. They're enamored with big I don't know what you call Trump, big papa or big daddy, like just taking care of everything, right? Daddy Warbucks, like taking care.
Proto-fascism.
Yeah, and I just this morning, like 15 minutes before our call started, before our video started, I saw this tweet from a well-known author that I like. I know his brother here in Nashville. And anyway, he tweeted something to the effect of, which I've heard this argument so many times. Like, he's a well-known author, so he's spoken all over the world. And he says, I've traveled so much and it's given me this deep appreciation for, even though there's so many things wrong in America, like we have so many freedoms that other places don't have, right? He said, he referenced a friend, and I'm not saying these are not real people, they probably are, but he referenced a friend that talked about how, I applied to start a business, and I don't even know what country he was referring to, but I applied to start a business. I'll know in a couple of years if I can start it. Or, another friend saying about his dictator leader, like, we can now leave the country or whatever. And those are all things that are probably real. There are countries that are really, oppressed in so many ways. I'm not denying that. But I replied and said, because again, I've spent 15 or so years outside the US in 30 plus countries. And I said, I think exactly the opposite. Global travel, frequent travel has made me think the opposite about the US. Like we are not as free. We are not near as free as we say that we are. We are actually a very oppressed people. And because we have this two-party system where we just go back and forth, right? I mean, 4 or 8 years, right? One president gets in and just dismantles everything the other one did. Then the next president gets in and dismantles what the other one did. And we're not actually making any real progress. We're just fighting against each other. And so nothing ever gets done. And we stay. And again, like you pointed out, these small government, pro-life Republicans are the ones that are instituting programs and resources that are actually hurting people in so many ways. And it's really tragic. It's really tragic that is, I don't know if it can happen, but I look forward to a day when we stop. And I know that this president, more than any other president in American history, has polarized us to the point where no meaningful, or I should say relatively few meaningful conversations happen over, different policies and abolishing the police and stuff, because it's so charged and so polarized. It is essentially a fuck you and fuck you back over and over and over again. Like you're totally wrong. No, you're totally wrong. And we can't actually make any progress. So I guess the next question I want to move on to is, how do we make progress? So you're, in your book, and I want to point people to it, and everything I've read and listened to you say online and otherwise, it tells me that it can happen. We can abolish the police and we can see a more bright and beautiful future. But how does that happen? Like, how do we make that happen? How does that happen in a country, again, where there are more guns than people and where people love their Second Amendment rights, where they can, and all these, and people love authoritarianism. They love the police. They love, seeing those, especially if they're, white and privileged, because they don't have to worry about getting stopped by that cop. Even if they are smoking weed on their front porch, they love, the presence of police and the presence of authority to make sure they're safe, even though, again, that's not actually happening. So how do we do this?
Well, first I want to say, it's important to keep in mind that, 30% or so of people in our society really benefit from the arrangements we have right now. They do have a lot of freedom. They have freedom to become fabulously wealthy, to travel, to start up businesses, to do all of that, and to benefit from that with, no real tax burden, no real regulation. But those benefits come at the expense of the rest of us.
Yes.
They are, just look at the Amazon situation. Amazon owners, and it's not just Bezos, it's the people who own stock in Amazon in a large amount. They have become fabulously wealthy. Well, where did that money come from? It came from people who are trapped in their homes, desperate to get things that they need. It's a direct transfer of wealth to people who are in crisis, to people who are already fabulously wealthy, with no sense of any social obligation, right? And they're doing everything they can to avoid paying any taxes so that some of that wealth can be redistributed to address the current crisis that we're in, where hospitals still can't get enough PPE, where it still takes, 4, 5, 10 days to get a COVID test back. We have a completely broken public health system. So what do we do about this? How do we address this, right? And I don't think we start by saying, well, let's imagine tomorrow there are no police and then figure it out from there. No, we have a system in place here. There's no magic switch that someone's going to find under a bush somewhere that's going to just poof, all police are gone. That doesn't exist. We have a massive system of policing and prisons. And what we've got to do is we've got to build a different politics. And it has to be an aspirational politics. It can't just be about all police are bad or, close all prisons. While I may support that in the long run, we need to have a politics that's about producing a sense of safety, security, and justice for people. And that means dealing with core issues of housing and education and healthcare and employment and economic security. And unfortunately, I think it's pretty clear that the leadership of both political parties is not prepared to really meaningfully embrace that we're going to have to build a new politics. But I see that underway. I mean, we can see that in some of the electoral victories that have occurred just this summer. New insurgent Democratic politicians who are going up against the old guard in places like St. Louis and New York and out in California and some other pretty unlikely places where people are trying to articulate this new politics. Because really, this is not just a movement about bad policing, right? Black Lives Matter is about a movement for racial and economic justice, right? And so we've got to build out that agenda, and it has to be a positive agenda, not just a negative agenda.
Yeah, I agree. I love that. I just interviewed Mark Charles, who is the 2020 independent candidate for president of the United States, and his, in his first 100-day plan, among other things, is to add really vital, to take out racist, sexist, misogynistic language out of the Constitution, to add some other language. But the whole idea is to make the Constitution reflect not just, because we the people isn't actually represented in there. It's very specific. It is white landowning men are represented, not one reference to a woman in the Constitution. And it calls for the literally the slaughtering of Indians, and Black people are 3/5 of a person in the Constitution. And so we need massive reform that truly reflects all the people, right? We the people didn't get it done. It doesn't mean everybody. We've seen that over the last several hundred years. We need, progressive ideas and aspirational politics that truly include everyone, not just some, right?
That's right.
I really appreciate your time. I know we just got cut off for a few minutes there, but I'm glad we got to come back on for this sort of closing couple of minutes. Thank you so much for your work. I want to give you a chance right here at the end. Obviously, people that are listening, go buy, listen to, read, however you want to consume it, The End of Policing, a wonderful resource that gives us, again, I think The End of Policing is very aspirational politics. It isn't all negative. It is ultimately about the good of all people, not just some of the people. But besides buying the book, what else do you want people to go check out or follow you or anything?
Well, folks can follow me on Twitter at @avitale with an E at the end. And I'm one of several nodes of a kind of national movement that's tracking these ideas and these movements. And also the Policing and Social Justice Project that I coordinate at Brooklyn College has a website about our work on gang policing and what a bad idea that is. And that's at policinginjustice.org.
That's amazing. Friends, we had 45, 50 minutes together with Alex today. There's so much more to talk about. So please go check out the show notes at letsgiveadamn.fm. I'm going to link to a bunch of different videos, different interviews he's done, different articles he's written. We didn't even get to talk about a really meaningful article that we meant to. So I'll link to all that in the show notes. Alex Vitale, thank you so much for your time, and thank you for joining us today.
You bet, Nick.
That's the show today, friends. A massive thanks to Alex Vitale for joining me on the show. We have so much to learn from his 30 years of work on this very important topic. I hope you'll visit letsgiveadamn.fm for more resources and links on this topic. And thank you all for listening. Seriously, I'm honored that you listen to these conversations. I'm blown away that you show up week after week. I created this show. Chad Snavely produced it, and Let's Give a Damn is part of the Matter Media family. You can reach out to me anytime at hello@letsgiveadamn.com. I'm sending so much love and peace to each one of you. Stay safe. Keep giving a damn. Bye for now.